Yes, this is Jerry Gidel again. This is our results from the Ford County uh, field survey. We had actually a 31 and a half acres, 31 and a half population. But the key thing is that we had a pretty solid rows around here at 17, and also the length today was about 35 to 36. Interestingly enough, with that solid kind of ear count, we had a 216 bushel yield. Interestingly enough, this is one of our better yields for the tour, but overall we've got very consistent levels in the 195 to the 220 zone. So it'll be quite interesting what our final number turns out to be.
Jack Scoville joins us today in our typical conversation with Jerry Gidel to talk about a new Illinois crop tour held last week. If you are interested in seeing that, stay tuned and don't forget to subscribe to Connected Farmer, your channel to keep you up to date with the latest trends in agriculture and livestock. So, Jerry, I want to start with you. I understand that you travel through 8 counties in the state of Illinois. And what have you seen? What was your goal there?
Well, this particular tour that Jack and I have been involved with here since 2016, and that we've kind of traveled the same general area here of Central Illinois. We get out of the city; it takes a while to do that, and then we go out kind of southwest of Chicago and start going through Grundy County, then Livingston, Wolford, McLean, DeWitt, come back through McLean again, and then hit Ford and Iroquois. And yes, traditionally that's a pretty good area of the state of Illinois, and that. But we both have felt that this gives us an interesting look at the best of what Illinois can do. Now, there's some areas around Springfield and Champaign that are not too bad either, or Decatur. But at this point, we've been kind of doing the same thing and for the last 6 years now, and in general we've had some pretty good luck of getting the feel of what kind of crops are out there in those fields, and that except for 2019 when we had an extremely late crop and lots of washouts and fields and things like that, to get a feel for a final Illinois crop size, because Illinois and Iowa are the two big states in corn.
Yes, Jack, welcome back to the program. What have you seen there this season?
Well, the corn this year was remarkably uniform and a good production. I think we found yields ranging anywhere from, say, 190 bushels on the low side up to about 210 bushels on the upside, maybe 220 bushels on the upside. So, and remarkably uniform within that range. Generally, in the past, we've seen one crop maybe with a huge yield of 250 bushels or something like that, and a couple of one or two with a yield below 190 bushels as well. So it kind of might average out into that area, but this year, just about everybody was in the same range. So that caught us by surprise. We had expected to see much more variable crops because of all the rain that Central Illinois has had. The soybeans, however, clearly had suffered. We didn't actually count soybeans, but we did take a look. And I would say 40% of the region, was in bad shape, with a lot of drowned out spots, a lot of yellow beans, a lot of very short beans that looked to me like they were going to yield significantly less than normal. And then maybe 60% of the soybeans looked just wonderful. The green carpet effect that everybody looks for, very clean fields, good size soybean plants, and good production potential there. So But overall, I think the soybean yield in Illinois will probably be down just because these prime areas for soybeans were having so much trouble. The corn yield looks to be a good yield this year in Illinois.
Yes, actually, I saw your yield estimate, and that's pretty similar from what you estimated last year.
Yeah, it is. It was a good crop. There's no doubt about it. And really, despite all the kind of extreme growing conditions that we've seen in central Illinois, mostly with all the rain. So that caught us by surprise. There were some problems with nitrogen. You could see where the nitrogen had washed out, for example, and that might affect final yields because it'll affect test weights and kernel sizes and things like that. But overall, the crop is clearly there.
Yes, and Jerry, by comparison, you saw more diseases than last year, and probably you saw a busier road there.
Well, interestingly enough, that looking at the fields sometimes in the past, you look at the outside of the field when you go into it, and you see in previous years with dryness, you'd see a lot of firing at the bottom of the field and things like that. Interestingly enough, we saw that not every field, but probably close to 50% or more. And the twist of it is it wasn't from the standpoint that the fields were extremely dry for the last month or so or 6 weeks. It's because we had some very hefty rains in this general area of the state. There was reports of anywhere 10 to 15 inches in less than a week or maybe 10 days of moisture that happened in late June, early July. And timing wise, that's an interesting situation when you're kind of getting ready to go into pollination and I think the corn plant seems to have an interesting ability to shed extra vegetation if it doesn't feel like it has the right nutrients or the right moisture or stuff like that. And so in this case, this year, we did see some firing in those things. And the other twist of it, as Jack has mentioned here in the soybean side of things, and that definitely once we got into Livingston County, that was our first one where we really started to see some significant areas of drowned out in that. And in past years, sometimes we went ahead and seen people go ahead and plant some beans or corn in those areas. But because of the lateness of this year's heavy rains, because up until this period that we just talked about, in that through late May and June, it was really on the dry order, probably getting a little bit on the side of the disappointment maybe on what kind of potential is. Then they went from too dry to too wet, and then the time it dried out, it was really too late timing wise to go ahead and replant into those areas. We've got some of that, some examples in our slides that we did, because we do put together a nice PowerPoint presentation on this for both Price Group and Midland Research. So it's interesting to see how things kind of work out. As Jack mentioned, very consistent. The twist of it is that the one thing that's happened this year versus last year, and that has been the improvement in the numbers of ears that we counted. Back again, Jack and I just back from the field. We went in 10 to 12 rows. We've counted the numbers of ears in 30 feet of 2 rows and averaged out the fact that we had 31.5 ears in the 30 feet. We'll go ahead and shuck these and then come back with the counts per ear, which will help determine how much yield we had in the field. Last year, because of the timing of some really cold and wet conditions in Illinois, the ear population on our tour last year was like 27.8. This year it's 32. So it's virtually 4 more ears that we were seeing on our 30 feet of row that we count to come up with our yields, and that's a pretty significant area. But then the opposite side of things are kernel length or ear length, if you want to call it that, was down 4 kernels or more on average this year versus last year. And so that's brought some of those yields down. Interestingly enough, though, as he mentioned, we're really pretty tight, 190 to the 220 level, and come up with our 207 bushel yield, which is about the high. We've had 2 other years of that 207 in the past, and so that's an interesting situation. I guess the one thing that I think Jack and I would both agree on is that this year's 207 maybe has a little bit stronger potential than last year's one. At least we anticipate the fact that there's going to be enough moisture to maybe fill this crop out. Last year, it really sank because of the fact that basically from August all the way through till October, minimal moisture here in the Eastern Corn Belt, and the yields kind of suffered because of that and slipped back down. I think the final number for Illinois last year was like in the low 190s after being the 207 when we counted the thing a year ago.
Yes, and Jack, now what did you feel about what have you seen? Did you feel that that was according with the market talk previously?
Well, I think the market's being a little laid back on the soybeans, judging from what I saw, which is, just one area, but I'm not hearing much about the potential for washed out areas or anything like that. So no, I don't necessarily think. I think soybean yields probably a little higher than they should be by being considered a little higher than they should be by the trade because of that and all the problems we've had in the northwestern Corn Belt up into the Dakotas and what have you. I think probably the beans are being a little overestimated. The corn numbers I've seen in the trade are okay to high. I think there's a lot of higher estimates out there in the 180 area, which is, I think, just absurd. I didn't see that type of potential out there. And I don't think that the weather in the Midwest generally has been good enough to support a super high yield and smashing the old records quite that way. I'm not disputing the fact, though, that corn crop's going to be good. I think our national yield estimate is around 176, which is indicative of a potentially tight situation. If our demand holds together as forecast by USDA, but still sufficient corn crop to meet the demand.
Yes, and Jerry, do you think the USDA in the future will do some adjustments?
Oh, well, there always is adjustments from the August number out until we get to the final there later in November and all the way to the final one in January. I guess, if we had the dynamics of last year where they had 181 and we ended up with 172, that would be a real shocker. I don't know that we're going to have that. I think the one problem that right now has happened in the general attitudes here about the 2021 yields. Yes, there's some good prospects, as we just mentioned, out here in Illinois and most likely in Indiana and parts of Iowa that got some rains in a timely fashion, and that other areas have not done that. And the interesting switch is, I think that this year particularly, instead of, because of what's happened last year and also the reemergence of some prevent planted acres in the plains that was still out there last year, around 10 million. We didn't get all that back into the system this year, but we did end up having in corn, good example, South Dakota, North Dakota here, they put 2.7 million more acres being planted this year. Now, maybe that didn't all get planted or whatever, or maybe it's not going to get harvested. I think that's another feature we're going to have to deal with, is what harvested acres are going to be. But that's a little bit of unknown. Right now, though, at the same time, Iowa and Illinois and the Eastern Corn Belt lost 1 million acres and switches over to beans because of corn on corn yields last year, or other issues. Maybe the derecho caused some issues where they couldn't really plant corn back on these fields because you can't really get the volunteer corn out if you got corn in the field. So anyway, that overall is another factor in here that's going to be and I think there's not enough people realizing the impact of what the Dakotas will have on our national yield. And I think that's the real issue of ours. Our 176 could be still too high, depending on what happens in those two states, and probably parts of Minnesota and Iowa, and how those final yields come in, because of the fact that we've got a higher portion of this year's crop in areas that are under the gun here because of drought.
Jack, do you have additional comments on the crop tour?
Yeah, well, first of all, it was a very good time. It's always nice to be out in central Illinois, and the weather was wonderful. So nice cool day and nice sunny day. So we were able to really get at it. I think the other thing that we haven't really mentioned is how late this crop is. We did go out a little earlier than normal by a few days, so that could affect the maturity level. But the crop, the corn crop, was in the milk stage, and normally it's more in dough, and even some fields are getting into dent by the time that we get out there. And generally, we're out before the crop report in August. Well, we always are before the crop report in August. So the difference is only a few days. So the crop is clearly late, and that could affect things later on as well, positively and negatively, but most likely negatively if we get into a cold situation or what have you here later on this year.
Yes, interesting. And Jerry, what can you comment about this Friday close in the market?
Well, it was a very typical, typical for what we've had recently, a choppy session this week, up and down, back and forth. Today, we came back with a little bit of a positiveness here on things. I think the fact that some of the more noted forecasters here for U.S. corn outputs from Memphis, Tennessee, and other places had a 176 to 177 kind of yields out there, which I think started to make some people, kind of blink a little bit here after seeing some of the 180 numbers that Jack mentioned from some of the satellite operators out here that project the yield from up in the sky. I think that's one of the issues Jack and I have really appreciated over the years, is that we try to go out there and look at the crop inside the field. And it's tough sometimes. You're driving by and it looks green, it looks tall. You can't see the washouts, except this year in the beans where you can see them because it's a big black dirt out there. But in this case, I think that at least we're trying to make a fair assessment of what we see, and that's only where we're at right now. It doesn't guarantee what it's going to look like 6 weeks or 2 months from now. Last year, it's just slowly just eked away on us here. Other years, we've seen the crop stabilize and even improve. And as I guess the one thing I mentioned earlier here, this is a snapshot of one of the best areas in Illinois and probably the country. That doesn't tell us what it looks like in Southern Illinois. It doesn't tell us exactly what it looks like in Northern Illinois or in what it looks like in the Dakotas. I've really heard a lot of issues out there and seen some. We've even some scenes earlier this week when they're chopping the corn. Wow, that's not what you're supposed to do with it. Partly because they need it for forage, and partly because the crop isn't looking very good. And I think, even as you know, in South America, they've also had a lot of issues here in Paraná about the crop getting beat up because of frost of all things. It got in late, it got dry, it got beat up that way. Now it's getting hit by 2 or 3 frosts. And I think that's a real feature in the corn market. That's where Jack and I have talked about here today. The demand side of this issue, I think, is still very, very strong. And I think right now, since the Chinese have been kind of quiet, and that everybody's kind of saying, "Oh no, it's no big deal." Well, last year after the rate show, they started to pick up a stream and buying things, and bang, zoom, things changed dramatically, and they got ahead of the game. So I don't know that the Chinese are going to be the one to lead us and get us excited about demand again. But I really think that that's a feature that's going to happen here, because the world total supply of corn has really been beat up, because U.S. is having issues, and the same thing with Brazil and the export market. And I think that's going to be an important factor to look at as we go forward. And next week, we'll be kind of looking at the report on next Thursday, and we'll see what the USDA wants to start our 2021 corn and soybean crops with.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you to both of you.
Thanks for having us.